So what we're gonna do next now is prepare this wall for sheathing. We got the wall sheathing that's gonna be going on the outside of that. If you have a little bit larger of a wall, sometimes you can frame a wall that's 30, 40 feet long if you have a long building. It might be a better idea if you don't have any heavy equipment to raise the wall now and put the sheathing on later. But putting the sheathing on while the wall is down has two benefits. One, it's a lot easier. You don't have to hold the sheet in place. It just lies flat on the ground. And two, it helps to keep the wall straight and square before you put it in place. You don't have to worry about it later. So we're gonna prepare the wall now. All right, so to prepare the wall for sheathing, one really important thing is we wanna make sure that this bottom plate is nice and straight. When we put the sheathing on, and if we nailed this sheathing on with the plate not being straight, say it has a big curve in it, when we lift it up, that bottom plate's gonna keep that curve because we just nailed everything in place. So we wanna make sure it's nice and flat and straight. So what we can do is we can actually use our floor as a reference, and I've straightened this wall up with our rim joist of our floor system. And I've actually used some 8-penny nails here and just every so often kind of did a toenail and made sure this bottom plate is nice and flush with our bottom floor system. And then one way you can check, just to double check that it's straight, you can take a chalk line, you can hook on to the stud or to the bottom plate and make sure that line's nice and straight. Doesn't have to be perfect, you can eyeball this. And you can come over to this side, put it in the middle over here, and as you sight down, you can see if this line isn't perfectly in the middle of this plate. You can tell that your wall isn't quite straight. So looks like we have the chalk line in the middle of the plate pretty much all the way down, so we know that this bottom plate is straight. All right, the second thing we want to do is we want to get this wall somewhat square. The sheathing is going to bring the wall into perfect square, but we'll get it close enough so we're not fighting. So what we're going to do is measure our diagonals here, just like we did on the mud sills and the foundation. So corner we got 174 and an eighth. This corner we got 173 and 5/8. So we're about a 1/2 inch off, meaning we need to rack the wall coming this way. So you want to hold on the corner again. If we had 174 and an eighth and 173 and 5/8, that's a 1/2 inch difference. So I'm going to bring this over a 1/4 inch to 173 and 7/8. It's about right there. All right, let's double check our corners here. And now we're at 173 and 7/8. So we're perfectly square right now. And that'll be close enough. You don't have to secure it or anything. It'll just get us close enough to start with here. So now something that we have to accommodate for is our thickness of our mud sill and our floor framing and our floor sheathing. What's gonna happen is we don't wanna put our wall sheathing flush with our bottom plate coming up, because this portion of wall sheathing actually acts as like an anchor. If you remember, we took our mud sills and we anchored them down to our concrete foundation with anchor bolts. And then our floor system is then anchored to our sill. And then of course our floor sheathing is anchored to our floor framing. So we're gonna tie all that together with nails by overhanging this wall sheathing all the way down to this concrete foundation. And by the time we're done, you can see why we, when we laid out our mud sills, we came in that 7/16 of an inch. That's the thickness of our sheathing. That's gonna sit right on top of this foundation, and this wall is gonna be nice and flush all the way down, which will give us a nice smooth surface for our siding when we get to that point. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure this, and we have about 7 3/4, which makes sense. 1.5 of mud sill, 5.5 inches of framing, and 3/4 of sheathing equals 7 3/4. So what we want to do is we basically want to hang the sheathing over 7 3/4. We're going to bring it up just a little bit so we don't have any interference. Sometimes there's a rock left over from pouring of the concrete or mortar or whatever, so we'll just give ourselves a little room for play. So we'll want to take 7.5 inches off of our sheathing, or overhang 7.5. So our sheathing is 48 inches. You subtract 7.5 from that and we have 40.5. So we're going to hook onto the bottom of our wall here and we're going to come up 40.5. And that's going to represent the top line of our sheathing. AJ will get that side. And then what we'll do is we'll give ourselves a reference line with some chalk here and a chalk line. I'll hook on here. The Zod will pull tight. Go to our 40.5 over there. And we'll snap a line. All right, so now you can see along this 40.5 inch mark, we have this reference line that we'll be able to use when we start laying down our sheathing. And now you can start to see why it was so important that we get that bottom plate nice and straight. If we ran a straight line with a curved bottom plate, you can see that when we nail all that together, that curve will stay in that board. So that prep work of getting that straight really pays off. Okay, so now that we are prepped, our wall's square, our bottom plate's straight, we have a reference line. The guys will bring over our first sheet of sheathing. And what we're gonna wanna do here is just double check and remember which way our layout is going. Looks like we laid out left to right. So just to double check, making sure that every single one of our stud lays out on a 16 on center. So our 8 foot looks good. We have our door. Excuse me. Our 4 foot looks good. 32 and 16 all look good. So all of our studs are in the proper location. And what we'll do is we're gonna lay down our first sheet. So this sheathing, if you take a quick look at it, has 2 sides to it. We got our rougher side. It also has painted lines usually. That's the side that's gonna come up. And when we place the wall up, that's gonna be the outside portion of our wall. The back side has a little bit smoother of a surface. It's nice and clean. That side's gonna go towards the inside of the wall. We want that rough side out. So we'll lift this guy up and we'll bring it over and start to put it in place. We're gonna come down to our 40.5 inch mark and we're just gonna get it roughly in place right now. And if you take a look, now that 16 on center layout will start to make sense. So we have our 4x8 sheet. We are nice and flush on the side here. And if you remember, we hooked on, came out to our 8 foot mark or our 16 on center, and we subtracted that 3/4 of an inch. That now makes sense because our sheet lands right in the center of this last stud. That gives us proper nailing surface here. And then when we bring on our next sheet, we'll have the other half to be able to nail on this seam. And now this seam has proper support behind it. We never want to have a sheet that ends in the middle of a stud. If for some reason we have to use a sheet and piece it in, maybe we're making a repair or something, and we have to fit in a 6 foot piece, we don't want to cut in a piece that has a seam in the middle. We'll cut right on the middle of that stud, trying to make as straight as possible of a line. You can see if we have a sheet that's in the middle and you start putting pressure on there, it shakes a little bit. That's not good. If you tried to drywall over that or side over it, you'd have cracked mud seams. So you want to make sure you're right on a stud. All right, so let's get this back into position of being on our 40.5 inch mark. Looking good in the middle. And we flush on our edge. Perfect. So what I like to do is nail the edge first. if you remember, our sheathing is cut at the factory, so you know that these edges are perfectly square. We've done a lot of prep work. We know our foundation's level, which means our floor is level, which means if we have a perfectly square wall and we stand it up, if we're level on the bottom, we're gonna be perfectly plumb. So the more time we take right now getting this wall perfectly straight and square, the better our house is gonna come out. Everything's gonna be plumb and we won't be fighting anything. So a good tip is to take your sheathing. Don't worry too much about the rest of the wall quite yet. We want to make sure we're on our 40.5 inch mark. I'm going to tack this in place. And it's important to note, we've now switched over to 8-penny nails. All wall sheathing uses these 8-penny nails. So I'm on the 40.5. I want to be just a little bit more flush. Can you let up just a little bit? Oh, the nail's in there. All right. Flush, and we're on our 40.5. So we'll nail that down. Now you can see, if we come down here, we have maybe a 32nd of an inch. We want to take that out. Remember, this edge is perfectly flat, and we want to get this perfect. So we'll bring it on over just a little bit. It's nice and flush, and we'll tack it. All right, so we're flush all along here. You can now see it paid off. We made sure we took our time and selected a straight stud for our corner post, and we have a straight wall. So we can go ahead and finish nailing this side off. Just like our floor sheathing, along any edge or bottom edge, we want to go every 6 inches with our nails. And then when we're in the field, anywhere inside the center part of our sheet, we want to go every 8 inches. So we'll nail this edge off. All right, so we have this side now completely nailed off, and we can check the another like double check, if you will, of this bottom plate being straight. We can come over here, and if we can look pretty closely, we can see that all of our chalk guidelines here, our sheet is right on that line. If we weren't perfectly straight, we could see these chalk lines being a little bit off. We got a perfect reference line on that edge. So if we move this, we can see we're down here. We want to bring that back into square, and all of our chalk lines should line up. So we're on our chalk line, and I just want to tack this in place here. And then just do one more double check, making sure we're all lined up and looks like we're good. One last thing we want to check, just before we nail this whole thing off, is to make sure that we are looking good along our stud here. Looks like we're sitting right in the middle. So we can go ahead and nail all this off. Okay, so we got this first sheet nailed off, and if you notice, we didn't nail anywhere along this seam, and the reason why I do that is because, again, this factory edge is nice and straight, and it's nice to be able to use that as a reference. If you nail along this edge and you accidentally hit that edge, it might blow it out a little bit, and it doesn't leave a nice straight edge. So I wait until we bring our next sheet in, which we have right here. We'll bring this guy in. And now we have a really nice reference to line this up. And if you could actually get a nice close-in view here, we have about a 1/16 inch of a difference here. That's actually really important. It's not close enough. We want to get this as close as possible to where it's like spot on perfect. And the reason why we do that, we're gonna have another row of sheeting on top of this, and on our sidewalls up the gable, we're gonna have another row of sheeting that's even on top of that. And that little bit of difference will actually magnify as you go up the roof, and it just creates problems later on. So the first row, if you get it perfect, the rest of the rows just follow suit. So it's really important to take that time and get that even. If you also see, we have a nice tight seam down here at the bottom, and we have a nice tight seam at the top. And that means that since we have a nice straight edge here, we know that this corner here is nice and square, and we should be right on our 40.5 inch mark. So looks like we're nice and square and we're ready to nail this off. So we'll come in here, we'll tack this in place, double check our edge, nice and smooth, and we'll nail. Now if you notice, on this one stud that has this seam, I'm not going straight in with my nail. I'm actually angling this nail just a little bit. That way you make sure you get enough of that meat of that stud and you don't accidentally split that stud out. So we'll get a couple nails in here just to tack. Okay, and then we'll come up on the top. When stepping on this wall, remember we are overhanging that 7 inches or so you don't want to step on that edge or you'll crack it off. All right, so we'll double check that we're on our 40.5 inch mark. We're looking perfect, and we'll nail this off. Oops. I'm actually gonna hold off from nailing on this edge because if you can see, we've left this sheet long. It doesn't really matter. We could actually pre-cut this sheet to its final length, then put it on. But it's just a quicker process to let it run long, snap a line. There's no measuring involved. You can sight down this stud and sight down the stud on the other end, snap a line, and you'll have a perfect edge along here, and then you can use the sheet on the other side. So let's go ahead and do that process right now. Zach, oh, you got the saw ready there. So we'll take a chalk line here. AJ, you want to take this side? Now AJ's going to hold it, sight down that 2x4 and place it right on the edge. I'm going to do the same over here. Looks like we got to come in just a little bit. All right. So now when we snap this, we have a line that's right along the edge of that 2x4. We can then come in with our circular saw. Now we're not gonna let our blade hang out all the way like this. We do want to adjust our blade. Azad's gonna unplug it. Whenever we're working near the blade, we wanna unplug it so our fingers don't get chopped off here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set this depth of this blade so it's just going through the sheathing. And the reason why we do that is if we accidentally, for some reason, got off on our line, we're not gonna be cutting up all of our framing. We'll just have a small little score mark, which isn't a big deal. So after we set our depth of our saw, we'll plug it back in and we'll make this cut. And you can see AJ here. AJ's in the perfect position to be able to support this piece. Let's say we're sheathing a roof and we're overhanging the roof. It's okay to just let it drop. But if we have the capability to support the piece, it's better because if we let it drop, chances are this last little corner is gonna chip away. And if we support it, it's just gonna be a nice clean cut. It's real important though when we are holding it that we don't like grasp it with our hands. You can see AJ has his hands underneath the sheet and he's basically just supporting it. He's not moving the sheet in any way. If he moves that sheet and it comes back towards this blade, it could pinch this blade and we'll have a kickback. So AJ's just supporting it, and he's still gonna let it just drop freely. All right, so now you can see we sighted down the edge of that stud and we went right along it. So that was a good clean cut. So what we'll do now is we'll finish nailing off this sheet, and we'll actually take that cutoff that we just cut off this end, and we'll start a new row at this top. And it's really important here. If you remember when we were talking about it in the opening, we're gonna stagger our sheets. And again, what that means is we lay our sheets horizontally along this wall, and we do that for the purpose of creating shear resistance. So if we laid these sheets going vertically, meaning 4 foot along the bottom and 8 foot coming up, we'd have a long seam going along this one stud. And basically what could happen is when wind blows, we would bend that wall along that seam. If we stagger our joints and break up that seam there, basically that sheet on the bottom would hold this seam together and it wouldn't bend as much. Also, with the shear resistance, this wall wants to rack back and forth, and these sheets are keeping this wall straight. We're putting all these nails in, and that nail along with the sheet is going to help keep this wall straight. So staggering these seams is going to help to keep this wall from racking as well. There's less seams all in one straight line. So it's a good idea to stagger these sheets at least by 4 foot. So this process is exactly the same as the first. We took that time to get this first row nice and straight. We'll start with a 4 foot sheet so we can stagger our seams, and we'll get this nice and flush. Now remember, this side is now a cut edge, so we don't have a perfect factory edge to line this edge up. But since we use that first sheet to get this stud straight, we know the rest of this stud is pretty much straight. What we do want to focus on is this end stud. This still does have a factory edge. So as long as we're in the middle down there and in the middle up here, then we know the rest of this wall is going to be straight with a good tight seam along the bottom. Then we can come back here, and you can see we have a little bit hanging over. We'll take care of that after we nail off the rest of this wall. We want to make sure we're in the center, because when we put this final remaining sheet on, we want to make sure that we land on center for the next sheet, if there was one. So always go off of your factory edges, either on the edge or starting on a stud, to make sure you're on proper layout. So we'll get this sheet laid up, or nailed down, then we're gonna lay on the next sheet and get this whole wall framed off. We're not gonna worry about this top part for right now. We'll talk about that in a little bit.